1985, 86, I was at Regis University and I was director of information services. And I had been on an airplane coming home from an AJCU business leaders conference at Gonzaga, and I was sitting next to Father Bill McGinnis, who was head of AJCU and a trustee at Regis. And I asked him, I said, why don't we have one of these for computing center directors? Because I know more about other institutions than Jesuit institutions. And he said, start one. I said, what does it take? And so he outlined what we needed to do. And a few weeks later, we had the CAUSE conference, and CAUSE was the Association for People Managing Technology. And I put out the invite for members of Jesuit colleges to show up at the CAUSE conference, and we'd get together and talk about it and plan for it. And we did. We got together, and there were three of us: Bernie Gleason at Boston College, and then Katie Doty at Loyola Chicago. And the three of us met. And of course, Bernie agreed to do the first conference, Katie the second, and I think Ron, you ended up as doing the third, if I recall.
I wrote the note the other day. We had that first conference was in Boston, and I didn't know anybody. We had sent out blind invitations via U.S. mail to presidents inviting people to come to the conference. And you know, Jack Corliss always just liked to tell the story about how the hotel we put him up in was close to campus, and we were doing everything on the cheap because we had no idea what people were willing to pay or how the travel budgets were, and of course all night long the cars were going underneath on the Mass Turnpike. We're going underneath the hotel and keeping everybody awake. So then, so that first conference, then it led to, as Mike was saying, to future conferences. We went out to Loyola and to Santa Clara.
Our first meeting was the first meeting, as Mark had mentioned. We got notified or invited to the meeting by snail mail because the timing preceded wonders like electronic communication easy. And remember thinking that this was a hell of a good idea, because the question I heard most from senior leadership when I raised some points is, what are the other Jesuit schools doing? And not really knowing anybody at any of the other Jesuit schools, it made it kind of difficult to respond to that question. And the initial invitation letter said that the first meeting would be at Boston College, and that they had already arranged to have a second meeting at Loyola Chicago the following year. And I got so excited, I immediately called my boss, Paul Locatelli, the academic vice president, and said, I want to host the third meeting. Can I go ahead and do that? And so I volunteered that Santa Clara would host the third meeting. And that sort of set up an East Coast, Midwest, West Coast rotation that we tried to follow for meetings all along. There weren't as many people at the first meeting, but it was wonderful to meet everybody, to talk about what we've been doing, to make contact with people that you could then call and ask questions about and help one another. And I think that started something that has been perhaps the most valuable thing for me in the whole CITM, is that of having peers to whom you could pose questions, ask advice, and get purely beneficial responses that were never contained a hint of politics or personal advancement from the person who was giving you advice, simply the best of their knowledge. And that has been a wonderful blessing for anybody who's been involved in the group.
As I mentioned, the first meeting I attended was the first one at Boston College, and my boss at the time was Father Joe Pomeroy, and he suggested I attend and drive down the Mass Turnpike from Worcester, Massachusetts to Boston. And I remember meeting people like Elliot Hagen at St. Louis U, and our host, Bernie Gleason, of course. I remember the dinner at Anthony's Pier 4. That was a treat. We revisited a few years ago, right? These people. So I wasn't in the senior position at the time, but they had, back then in the 80s, the head of IT had to do it all. They had to buy the equipment. They had to install the equipment. They were generally the senior engineer also. So they had to be, bridge that gap between the business side of the operation and the technical side. And I remember being so impressed with what was clearly a very difficult job to lead a new industry, trying to speak to business people at your institution that did not understand technology back in the 80s. That was the job of the head of IT, was to explain all of this to people who that wasn't part of their experience. So a real challenge. And I remember being so impressed by these leaders in those early conferences.
I could say I went back to the first meeting, but I think I actually went back before the first meeting. I have this vague recollection of Mike Sistrokey and Bernie and a few other people meeting with Jesuit, at a cause or EJCU. We're talking about organizing and the bylaws and all this. But Bernie Gleason, who is the CIO at Boston College, he really set a great tone where people could share. And really, we were at considerably different levels in the advancement of technology at our own campuses and had considerably different resources. And going to Boston, it was clear that we were in a place that was very successful up to that point with technology because of the cleverness, in large part, to Bernie Gleason, who later won an EDUCAUSE award. Sharing and feeling like you didn't have to be embarrassed about what you had. The CIOs were completely open with each other, and it was really a great group of people, that developed this attitude, again, in large part because Bernie got up. I think one of the first things he said was, we're just gonna lay it all out here, and he did. And it was just a wonderful experience, which again set the tone for subsequent meetings. And I knew I wanted to host a conference in Buffalo, but just as much. Everybody in the CTIM knew they never want to come to Buffalo. May is much too early to come to Buffalo. So, we did get people to come, and it was an early conference. And one of the reasons I wanted to go to an early conference, because there's a certain amount of competition in these conferences, that each one was better than the one before it. And I knew that I had to get in early if I had any prayer of doing a credible job. So we did ours, let's say 1991 in Buffalo.
First meeting was at Boston College in 1986. I remember it was a little awkward because we were just starting out and we didn't know what we were doing, except we were getting together and we didn't know each other. So we talked about nothing but computer stuff. And Bernie Gleason, who was our host, kept the cost of the conference down by getting us rooms in the local Howard Johnson. And in Boston, there's not a lot of room, so that was built over top of the interstate. So you could sit and read or take a shower and listen. No matter what you did, you were listening to the traffic right beneath you. So it was memorable. Bernie made an impression on all of us, and it got us off to a good start.
And had a wonderful time with Bernie. And I saw the magic of what Bernie was putting together with that group, which was sharing ideas. What works, what doesn't work, why were we successful? And probably one of the most important things I learned from Bernie, because he was an interesting visionary, was surround yourself with smart people, number one. Number two, find out who controls the pocketbook.
The things that surprised me was the willingness of everyone to be so cooperative, helpful, and sharing their time and their talents with everybody else on the group. I mean, it was infectious. I mean, we all did that then, and certainly enjoyed the company of each other at these meetings as much as we enjoyed hearing about what other people were doing and the content of the actual presentations that we were attending.
Interesting. I was hired by Loyola as a full-time CIO administrator, and 2 weeks later, I found myself in St. Louis at the 5th, I believe it was, AJCU meeting. Elliot Hagen was the CIO at St. Louis. The word internet hadn't been invented yet. I'm not sure the word web had. And so I was just in a process of listening. And it was a great, great learning experience for me, that first meeting with Elliot and those folks. And then I hooked up with one of the founders, Mike Zastroki, because he was doing consulting at Gartner. Hey, John, I understand you're teaching it. Can you do it? And I said, I am a doer. I'm just masquerading as a teacher. And a couple conversations with the provost, and I took an early retirement from the steel industry, which was getting overrun by imports anyway. So I spent 23 years in the steel, Bethlehem Steel, the largest steel plant in the world. It's Baltimore Sparrows Point, and then 23 years at Loyola. And both, I feel so blessed to have had two wonderful, wonderful careers.
I remember about John, I think it may have been at Loyola, Maryland. I think they may have been hosting, but we were just starting to use these mobile devices. And John made a presentation about mobile devices, and he took like 50 things out of his pocket at the podium and started telling us what they were all for and how you do this and how you do that. And damn, I had to run out and buy a cell phone after that. It was just, it was so real that he was actually carrying all these things around. And I think he took the privilege of being CIO to experiment with all the interesting things that were happening to try to figure out whether they made sense in higher ed. So that was an eye-opener for me. And then I started to be a little more adventurous about things.
First meeting was in '93 at Loyola, Maryland. I had become the IT director that year, and my boss, the executive director for IT, and myself went to the meeting in Baltimore. And I remember the thing I remember most about it is that we had no money. We had just gone through budget cuts and layoffs, and we didn't have money for a hotel room in Baltimore. So Marie and I drove from Washington to Baltimore in the morning and drove back in the evening and drove back the next morning. So our first conference was on a very frugal budget, but I was impressed by the intimacy of the meeting. It's a relatively, compared to something like EDUCAUSE, it's a very intimate meeting, and the great deal of collaboration and sharing that happens at the meeting, and it became very clear that it was something that we wanted to become involved with over the long haul. And
again, was in Scranton, and what I remember is how welcoming everybody was. I was a kid. I believe I took over as CIO when I turned 11. And I was incredibly young, coming from a very small school and mixing with some incredibly talented individuals that had a significant amount more experience than I did.
My first was at Holy Cross in Worcester in 1998, I believe, although I started at Regis in 1997. I remember Jack Corliss sort of being critical of my absence. It was hard to think of anything else beyond sort of the campus boundary, but so glad I did. So glad I went that year. And I think I attended every conference other than the one in Guadalajara.
I think that's the thing that stood out to me about this group is just the immediacy of friendships and the mutual respect and the mutual banter. But it was just a group that, I formed. I think my first meeting was the 2001 in Loyola Marymount. And I was just struck by how, knowledgeable and great these people are. But
the CIO at the time, Charlie Hodgelick, who was left us. He passed away back in 2005. He took me with him. He said, we're going to do this AJCU conference. You've never been before. You should really come. I was shy at the time. Shockingly, I know no one's going to believe that. Ron's laughing. I was shy, and I really didn't want to go and network. I didn't want to schmooze. I didn't want to see other people. I wasn't really going to go out and meet other parts of the Jesuit schools. So Charlie took me, and what I was struck by when we first walked into Georgetown was that everybody knew each other. And somehow you would think that as someone who might be shy or didn't know, you'd make that off-putting. But it was such a welcoming experience. It was like old friends returning to camp. When you see, you always talk about your camp friends, and they got back together, and I started to think, I wonder if Charlie goes out to dinner with these people on a regular basis, or, did he go golfing with them? Did he hang out with them? Only to find out that, yes, he did, but not like every single day, but their camaraderie, the way they embraced each other physically, the hugs when you walked into CITM made me say, what the hell happened? Where am I? And what just happened?
My first CITM meeting was actually in Georgetown. And I was very new to Jesuit institutions and AJCU. And as soon as I arrived, they asked me to serve on a panel. So that was an extremely rewarding experience. And I fell in love with that conference ever since.
Send everyone. And I happen to be working directly with the one of the founders almost of the CITM, and Jack Corliss. And so Jack attended every single meeting. So when we got to figuring out who was going to go, I usually said, I'll stay back because we need Jack Corliss at these meetings. And that kind of worked for some time. So my first meeting that I attended was in 2004 at Marquette University. And it was a pleasure after almost 20 years of seeing the organization, seeing the results. I was able to attend. And what I remember most about the first meeting was, number one, was it was close to Chicago. So a couple of us drove together up to Milwaukee to visit Marquette. And we got there a day early, and we went to a Milwaukee Brewers baseball game before the conference started. And then I remember very well the very nice dinner that we had just a few miles north of Milwaukee.
My first CITM meeting was in Philadelphia at St. Joseph's. And the thing that struck me immediately was the collegiality amongst the group, the absolute pureness of the relationships. There were folks from all these schools that really just genuinely enjoyed one another's company and were committed to the Jesuit mission. And it was quite apparent to the newbie.
Guadalajara for the OSHAL AJCU joint meeting and met people from CITM. I remember Ron was there. And it was a little confusing for me at first, these different groups and different people who overlapped. But finally I got it. And I went officially to the 2005. And that was at St. Joseph's. So I was new at St. Joseph's, and apparently USF was about to host 2 years from then. So I became automatically a program chair. And that was when there was a lot of talk about changing the name from EdTech to something else. And I just found myself in the middle of this fascinating group of very energetic people with a lot of ideas. And there I was, a part of it all. So that was my first experience.
I actually joined CITM in 2005. I became a member of the Creighton community in 2002. The person that I worked under at that time felt it was very important that Creighton become more active in the CITM, specifically in the different subgroups at that time. It's a very unique experience, very unique group of individuals who come together once a year physically, but being able to make those connections during the conference as well as outside of the conference.
Pretty sure that my first CITM meeting was in, I want to say it's 2006. I know it was at Lemoyne. So whenever Lemoyne hosted, I believe it was 2006. And it was really because of Bruce Montes and Dan Vonderheide and Jack Corliss, my colleagues at Loyola, who said, you really ought to be involved with this group and participate, and you should really try to go to this meeting. And I'd been at Loyola for probably, I don't know, 4 months-ish, something like that. So I get to Lemoyne, and, you know, similar to what Silvio described, the friendliness, the welcoming nature of the group, the inclusiveness. I believe that was also a joint libraries IT meeting, because my Dean of Libraries was there, Bob Seal, and we were building an information commons together. The building was under construction at Loyola, so we were collaborating about how we would go forward in terms of managing services and other things. And so it was just a really fantastic introduction to the group. And I guess the one thing I remember, I mean, that was so long ago, but the one thing I remember about that particular meeting was the reception that we had, and I'm sure Ron might remember this, at CX Tech, at the big warehouse at CX Tech, and just being able to walk around and visit and meet people, and it was a lot of fun. So that was my first CITM meeting.
Was also shortly after I became CIO, and it was at the University of San Francisco in 2008. What I remember most vividly about that was how intimidated I was by being in the company of, you know, 24 CIOs or 25. I can't remember how many schools were represented there. But I had only been in IT, as I mentioned earlier, for a year and a half or so by this point. I had not had that much exposure to CIOs and the way they think and talk about technology and strategy in universities. So that experience was amazing. I also really remember how being completely gaga over how Tracy Schroeder held a room. She was, I believe, the president of the CITM at the time, and she was so thorough and smart and meticulous and charismatic and logical. I mean, it was just being in the presence of all those CIOs was both intimidating, but also gave me sort of standards against which I could maybe measure my own career. So, and I also fell in love with the mission of higher education. And, you know, I had been at a Jesuit high school, I had been at Jesuit University, I had been educated by Jesuits for pretty much my whole career up until that point. And so I really fell in love with the mission of higher ed and working towards that mission. And then in 2008, I was appointed to the CIO role and have been in that role ever since. And I have, I think I've made almost all the conferences that have been held since that point. So
the first CITM meeting I attended was the 2010 at Fordham. So Flora, you did a fantastic job with it. It was, I just remember being just so happy to be with so many colleagues who were in kind of the same situation as I was at a, you know, Jesuit Catholic private school, and just remembering how the sessions resonated with me, and just how much I learned from my peers at that first meeting.
It was actually only my second year, so it was 2011, and I happened to be 7 months pregnant, and it was Santa Clara that was hosting, so thank you, Ron. And we're just talking with everybody. There's about 25 people, and as per usual in those days, there was only 3 women at the dinner and mostly men. And I had befriended Kay from Gonzaga a few minutes before dinner, and I at some point during the dinner, she and I were chatting across it, and I said, "Hey Kay, can I talk to you out there?" And so we walked out, and she said, "What's going on?" I said, "I'm not feeling really well, and I wanted to let somebody know that I'm probably about to pass out." And she was like, "All right, I got this." So she sits me down, and the next thing I know, I am on a stretcher going into an ambulance, and my boss is freaking out. And 25 people just watched me pass out in a restaurant. And so then the next day, of course, all of you knew this, and it became kind of the joke. "Are you okay? Are you okay?" And so for the next 3 days, like, I could not be okay because I had, 100 mother hens over me.
2013 annual conference
at Loyola University, Chicago. I was barely a few months into my role, still honestly getting my bearings at Regis. I remember leaving Chicago with the feeling that there's something different about this group.
This meeting was in 2013, and it was when Loyola Chicago hosted. And part of the reason it was late is because that's when we were invited as HistoryWorks to participate in this conference. So in the fall of 2012, Jack Coloros had contacted Terry Fife, she's the owner of HistoryWorks, and asked her to help with this history project that was starting. And so Terry brought me in as an alumna of Loyola Chicago and someone on the team at HistoryWorks, and worked with Jack and Bruce and Mark via Zoom in those days. And in the spring of May of 2013, that's when the conference was held. And that's when I got to meet everybody in person, besides Jack and Bruce, of course. And I remember talking to everybody because I was in a small room interviewing people. That was my role, was to hunt people down and to place a recorder in front of them and talk to them and interview them about their memories of the CITM when we were starting this project. So I also remember we had a gorgeous few days for the conference. It was in May and we got a stroke of good luck. We had beautiful weather and it was fun to be up at the Lakeshore campus up in Rogers Park, as well as the Water Tower campus downtown. And we had a great dinner at Ditka's downtown. That was a lot of fun. And it was a great few days that we had in Chicago. So those are my memories of that first meeting that I went to.
I think it was 2014 probably was my first meeting. And I remember everybody being so welcoming, and it really, I remember thinking, things like this is awesome. Here are 27, 28, I think we were missing a few CIOs, maybe 26 CIOs in a room, talking very candidly. And it's a very unique experience.
First conference I went to was out in Seattle, actually, I believe. I was struck by the collegiality. And it was nice that although we had different size institutions, that mission-centric piece of being a Catholic Jesuit institution really came through, which it was good to me. I think part of it was what called me to work at the University of Scranton was the mission, and it was nice to see that throughout and hear that from an IT perspective. I think that's what stood out to me.
I arrived at Seattle University in June of 2016, the week after the 2016 CITM meeting. So my first meeting was actually in 2017, which also happened to be the year that Seattle University was hosting the CITM event. So my first CITM event was the year that I was essentially Master of Ceremonies to host the event at Seattle University. What I remember from that first meeting that I participated in is that the buses didn't show up to get people from the hotels to our campus on that first morning due to a mix-up. So we had quite the adventure of individuals taking Ubers, walking the 1.5 miles to campus, etc., before getting started just a little bit late that morning. Everything else seemed to go pretty smoothly after that.
If I remember correctly, it was in St. Louis. So that was probably my first time, where I had the full conference, and it was on a campus, and it was really great. I think one of the things I really enjoy about the conference is that it's a great mix of great, networking and professional content, right? And hearing from other campuses what they're doing, but also it's a lot of fun. So I still have my coffee cup from the St. Louis Museum of Blues. That was an unforgettable evening. We even got people from the conference come and play with the band, and it was really great, a lot of fun.
When I went, I was a little overwhelmed to begin with because everybody knew each other already. And so that was like, oh, geez, you kind of feel like an interloper, or outsider with that experience. But that was gone pretty quickly. And I think the first person that I started talking to right away was Krista at LMU, because we have similar roles. After that, it was pretty easy. You got to know everybody real quick. And it is a really unique group. I heard a little bit of what Silvio was talking about there, and just my limited experience, I concur. It just feels like an extended family, even though we're at different schools and we probably compete with a number of the same students, at least those of us that are geographically located close together. You just don't get that vibe.
But it became very clear that after the pandemic hit, that it just was not going to work, that people were not going to travel here, that things, we had a national emergency declared as well as the District of Columbia emergency. We had moved to a fully virtual institution. There was just no way we could to do that. The opportunities were for maybe having a new model for the conference just because it was fully virtual, but it all worked out. And the opportunity for a virtual conference was, the face-to-face conference, schools could really only afford to send 2 or 3 people to a face-to-face conference because of the cost of travel. And we decided that since we were doing a virtual conference, well, we should just invite all of the IT staff from all of the schools, not only in the US, but worldwide, because it's possible that people worldwide can join us. And if they can't join us live, they can join us asynchronously and watch some of the content. And the content's going to be very rich. We're going to have something like 70 sessions, nearly 100 speakers, 6 or 7, really 7 tracks, a double CITM track, a sponsor track, and then the traditional tracks, CIO, PPM, TTL, and ITSec. And we're doing a keynote every day, which is very exciting. 2 from our provost is going to be giving the opening keynote on lessons learned from the pandemic for Georgetown, and then a panel discussion of 4 academics who wrote a book on the future of higher education and how the pandemic will really change the higher ed landscape for many years to come.